A billionaire CEO's world shatters when a little boy he's never met approaches him at a cafe, stares at him for a while and tells him, "Mom said you'd pretend not to know me." Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The cafe was quieter than usual, the hum of conversations blending with the clinking of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine. Jacob Lawrence rarely allowed himself these kinds of moments, a rare pocket of stillness in a life that ran at full speed. His schedule was relentless, his days packed with meetings, negotiations, and the endless pursuit of expansion. Yet here he was, indulging in an afternoon of solitude, seated at a corner table with a black coffee and a tablet full of reports he was only half reading. He was used to being recognized. Even outside the world of finance, his name carried weight, his face gracing magazine covers, his business dealings scrutinized in interviews. Occasionally, someone would approach him, eager for a handshake, an investment pitch, or a photo to show off on social media. But he had perfected the art of polite disinterest, a few well-placed nods and vague smiles enough to brush off interruptions without seeming outright dismissive. So when he felt a presence lingering beside his table, he didn't react at first, assuming it was just another bystander working up the courage to say something. But seconds passed, and whoever was standing there still hadn't spoken. Jacob glanced up, expecting to see some eager entrepreneur or an awestruck intern. Instead, he found himself staring into the unwavering gaze of a small boy. The child looked about 8 years old, standing there with an almost unnerving stillness. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't looking around nervously like most kids his age would. He just stared. There was something about the way the boy held himself, the intensity in his eyes, hazel eyes, familiar in a way that made Jacob's stomach tighten. Jacob cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "Hey there, kid! You lost?" The boy didn't answer. Jacob glanced around, expecting to see a parent nearby, maybe someone coming over to explain the awkward encounter. But no one approached. The cafe patrons continued their conversations, unaware that Jacob Lawrence, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was suddenly at a complete loss for words in front of an 8-year-old. Just as he was about to speak again, the boy finally opened his mouth. "Mom said you'd pretend not to know me." The words hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he thought he had misheard, that maybe the boy had mixed him up with someone else. But the way he stood there, calm, certain, unshaken, made it clear that he had said exactly what he meant to say. Jacob's mind scrambled for meaning. His breath hitched slightly as he studied the boy more closely. The shape of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his brows furrowed slightly in that same way Jacob's did when he was deep in thought. No. It wasn't possible. "Kid, I think you've got the wrong." Before he could finish, the boy turned on his heel and walked out. Just like that. Jacob shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but by the time he reached the doorway, the boy had already disappeared into the crowd outside. His gaze darted left, then right, scanning the sidewalk for any sign of that small figure, but he was gone. Jacob stood there, frozen, the sounds of the city roaring back into focus around him. What the hell had just happened? Slowly, he returned to his seat, his coffee now lukewarm, his appetite gone. He leaned forward, rubbing his temple, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. Was this some kind of joke? A setup? A bizarre scam? The logical part of his brain told him it was nothing, a misunderstanding. He was a public figure, maybe the kid had seen him on TV, heard his name, and made up some elaborate story in his head. But deep down, something nagged at him. Because he hadn't imagined the resemblance. By the time he returned to the office, the interaction still weighed heavily on him, an intrusive thought that refused to be buried under spreadsheets and quarterly projections. His assistant, Lena, noticed immediately. She had worked with him for years, long enough to recognize when something had knocked him off balance. "You're quiet," she observed as she placed a stack of documents on his desk. Jacob barely glanced up. "Am I not allowed to be quiet?" Lena smirked. No. You're usually issuing commands like a dictator before you've even taken off your coat. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I just had a weird encounter at the cafe. Lena raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Weird how? Someone tried to sell you a startup idea again? No. He hesitated, fingers tapping against his desk. A kid walked up to me and said, something strange. She frowned. Strange how? Jacob hesitated again. What was he supposed to say? That an 8-year-old had just implied they were related? That for the first time in his life, he felt like something completely out of his control had just shifted the ground beneath him? He shook his head instead. It's nothing. Just threw me off for a second. Lena didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Well, whatever it was, shake it off. You've got that investor call in an hour, and then a dinner with the Singapore delegates. I need you at full dictator capacity. Jacob forced a smirk, nodding as she walked out. But as soon as the door clicked shut, his smile faded. He turned in his chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, a city he had conquered, a world he had built. But right now, all he could think about was a pair of hazel eyes that looked too much like his own. Jacob barely lasted an hour before realizing he wasn't going to get anything done. The numbers on the screen blurred together, the reports in front of him unreadable. His usual razor-sharp focus had been replaced by an unsettling loop of the same 3 seconds playing over and over in his mind. Mom said you'd pretend not to know me. The way the boy had looked at him, the quiet certainty in his voice, like he already knew what Jacob's reaction would be. Like he had expected disbelief. Jacob had met countless people in his life. Businessmen, politicians, celebrities, people who'd do anything to be in his orbit. He had been approached by scammers before, people with outlandish claims, looking for a payday. But this wasn't that. There was something about the kid, about the way he had spoken, the way he had simply walked away without asking for anything. And that was what disturbed him the most. The kid wasn't trying to convince him. He already believed it. Jacob pushed back from his desk, rubbing his temples. He needed answers. He needed to know if this was real. With a sharp exhale, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He hesitated for a second before hitting the call button. Lawrence, a voice answered on the second ring. Reynolds, Jacob said, leaning back in his chair. I need you to find someone for me. There was a brief pause, then a low chuckle. You do realize I usually track down your rivals, right? Not children. Jacob clenched his jaw. Just get me everything you can. Young boy, about 8 years old, hazel eyes. His mother, whoever she is, clearly knows me. I need names. Addresses. Anything you can find. There was a pause. Then the investigator's voice turned serious. You think he's yours? I don't think anything yet, Jacob muttered. That's what you're going to find out. Understood, Reynolds said. I'll be in touch soon. Jacob ended the call and tossed his phone onto the desk, staring at it like it held the answers he needed. He had always been a man of action. A problem solver. He built his empire by controlling every variable, predicting every outcome. But this was the first time in years that he felt completely out of control. The next 48 hours were unbearable. He worked, but his mind wasn't there. He attended meetings, but his thoughts drifted. His assistant, Lena, noticed. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said at one point, arms crossed as she watched him fidget with his pen during a board meeting. Something like that, he muttered. When his phone finally buzzed with Reynolds' name flashing across the screen, Jacob answered before the first ring even finished. I've got your report, Reynolds said. Sending it over now. Jacob's inbox chimed. He pulled up the email, his eyes scanning the details, his breath catching as he read the name. Will Benson. Age 8. Mother, Olivia Benson. Current address, a modest apartment on the east side of the city. Jacob stared at the name, his chest tightening. Olivia. Suddenly, he was thrown back nearly a decade, to a time when he had been a very different man. Or maybe not so different, maybe just less aware of what he was leaving behind. Olivia had been kind. Funny. Different from the women who usually gravitated toward him. She hadn't cared about his money, his status, or the empire he was building. She had wanted something real. A home, a life away from the spotlight. And Jacob, in his arrogance, had convinced himself that was too small of a dream. They had ended things cleanly. No dramatic fights, no bitter goodbyes. She had just left. And he had let her go. And now, 8 years later, a child with his eyes had walked up to him in a cafe. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests tightly. Had she known? Had she been pregnant when she walked away? His stomach twisted. Had he missed everything? Anger flickered inside him, a sharp, unfamiliar kind of fury. Had she kept this from him on purpose? Had she decided, without telling him, that he didn't deserve to know? That he didn't deserve to be a father? Jacob had spent years building a life where he was always in control. And yet, here was the single most important thing he could have ever been a part of, and he had been left out of it entirely. No. That wasn't going to stand. With renewed determination, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Lena, he called as he passed his assistant's desk. She looked up, raising an eyebrow. Where are you rushing off to? I have unfinished business, he said, his voice steady. He didn't owe Olivia the benefit of the doubt. He didn't owe her patience or understanding. She owed him answers. And he was going to get them. Jacob pulled up outside the apartment building, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The area was nothing like his world, no valet parking, no gleaming skyscrapers, no marble lobbies with gold accents. It was modest but clean, a simple 3-story complex with a small garden out front. He could already feel the difference. This wasn't a place built on power plays and million-dollar deals. This was a home. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his cufflinks out of habit, though he felt strangely out of place in his expensive tailored suit. He had walked into countless negotiations, faced down men twice his age in boardrooms where billions were on the line, but now, for the first time in years, he felt unsure of his next move. But he wasn't leaving without answers. He strode up the walkway, found her apartment number, and knocked. No hesitation. No backing out. A few seconds passed, then the door swung open. Olivia Benson stood there, arms crossed, expression unreadably calm, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. Took you long enough, she said dryly. Jacob blinked, momentarily thrown off by her complete lack of surprise. Of all the ways he had imagined this playing out, this wasn't one of them. That's all you have to say? He asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Olivia leaned against the doorframe, her lips quirking up in something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, I thought maybe you'd find out sooner. But then again, you were always busy running the world. Jacob's jaw clenched. Don't do that. Don't act like you didn't keep this from me on purpose. She sighed, pushing the door open wider. Might as well come in. I doubt you'll leave without a full interrogation. He stepped inside, immediately noticing the contrast to his own surroundings. His penthouse was sleek, minimalist, filled with cold, expensive furniture chosen more for aesthetic than comfort. But this place was warm. Lived in. A couch with a colorful knitted throw draped over it, books stacked haphazardly on a coffee table, a child's drawings pinned to the fridge. A life had happened here. A life he had never been a part of. Olivia walked into the kitchen and grabbed a mug from the counter. You want coffee, or are you just here to yell at me? Jacob ignored the jab, following her inside. Why didn't you tell me? She sighed, setting the mug down. Because back then, I didn't think you'd stop long enough to care. His hands curled into fists at his sides. That wasn't your choice to make. Olivia finally looked at him, really looked at him, and there was something in her gaze that made his anger waver. Wasn't it? She asked softly. Jacob, when I found out I was pregnant, you were already halfway to building your empire. You weren't even in the same world as me anymore. You had your eyes on the future, on something bigger. And she shook her head. I wasn't part of that. Not really. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. So you just decided I didn't deserve to know? Olivia gave a humorless laugh. You think it was that easy? That I just made the decision like I was ordering takeout? She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I wrestled with it. I wrote out a dozen messages I never sent. I almost called you so many times. But every time I asked myself, what would telling you change? Would you have dropped everything? Would you have been ready to be a father? Jacob opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped. Because the truth hit him like a slap. Back then, he wouldn't have been. He had been too obsessed with expansion, too fixated on making Caldwell Enterprises a name that would last for generations. He had barely had time for himself, let alone a child. If Olivia had told him, if she had begged him to be a part of it, would he have listened? His silence was answer enough. Olivia sighed. That's why I didn't tell you. Jacob swallowed hard, his hands braced on the kitchen island. His gaze flicked to a small backpack on the floor by the door, a pair of tiny sneakers neatly lined up beside it. Proof of the years he had lost. You don't get to make that decision for me, he said quietly, but there was no longer rage in his voice. Just something heavier. Regret. Olivia studied him, something softening in her expression, but not enough to erase the hurt between them. You're right, she admitted. But I made it anyway. Because I had to. And honestly, I don't regret it. Will's had a good life. A stable life. He's never once wondered if his dad loved him from a distance. I made sure of that. Jacob's throat tightened. He deserves to know me. Olivia nodded slowly. I'm not stopping you. But this isn't a business deal, Jacob. You don't just get to sign a contract and claim him because it's convenient for you now. I don't want convenience, Jacob said. He let out a breath. I want to know him. Olivia searched his face, looking for something, maybe sincerity, maybe proof that he wouldn't disappear the second his schedule got too full. After a long pause, she nodded. Okay, she said. But we do this on my terms. Slowly. No sudden declarations, no forcing him into anything. You earn his trust, the same way any parent has to. Jacob nodded because what else could he do? Then, for the first time since he had walked into that cafe and seen those hazel eyes staring back at him, he felt like he was standing at the beginning of something real. Jacob had never been the kind of man to do things halfway. When he committed to something, he went all in, whether it was building his empire, sealing a deal, or ensuring that Caldwell Enterprises remained untouchable in the business world. But fatherhood wasn't a corporate acquisition. It wasn't something he could conquer with strategy and resources. It was messy, unpredictable, and filled with uncertainty. And, as he was quickly learning, Will wasn't impressed by him. Olivia had been clear, no grand gestures, no forcing Will into anything he wasn't ready for. Jacob had agreed, but patience had never been his strong suit. He wanted results. He wanted something tangible, proof that he wasn't just some stranger barging into the kid's life. So he did what any rational man would do, he overcompensated. The first attempt was dinner. He had arranged for a reservation at an exclusive restaurant, somewhere nice, upscale, refined, the kind of place where the wine list was longer than the menu and the waiters spoke in hushed, dignified tones. He thought it would be a perfect opportunity to get to know Will, to sit down and have a conversation like two people forming a connection. The moment Will walked in, he took one look at the white tablecloths and crystal glasses and wrinkled his nose. "Why is everything so shiny?" he asked, poking at his reflection in the spoon. Jacob smirked, amused. "Because it's a nice restaurant." Will glanced around, then leaned in slightly. "Do they have chicken nuggets?" Jacob glanced at the menu. No nuggets. No fries. No crayons. He suddenly realized that the only other children in the restaurant were the kind who sat stiffly, elbows off the table, clearly coached by their wealthy parents on how to behave like tiny adults. Will, on the other hand, was an actual child. A child who, after 5 minutes, looked completely bored out of his mind. "Can we go to McDonald's instead?" Will asked bluntly. Olivia, sitting across from them, barely contained her smirk behind her wine glass. Jacob exhaled, signaling the waiter. "Check, please." Lesson 1. Expensive doesn't equal better. He tried other things, gifts, activities, trips. None of them landed the way he expected. He had bought Will a limited edition drone, thinking it would impress him. The kid barely glanced at it before going back to drawing with a handful of crayons. Jacob tried talking about his work, thinking maybe Will would find it interesting. But the moment he mentioned investment portfolios, Will's eyes glazed over like he was hearing a bedtime story in a foreign language. It wasn't until a week later, during one of their awkwardly scheduled meetups, that Jacob finally got it right. Will had been sitting on the floor in Olivia's apartment, flipping through a colorful book with intense focus. "What are you reading?" Jacob asked, crouching beside him. Will barely looked up. "Dinosaurs." Jacob scanned the page. It was filled with illustrations of towering prehistoric creatures, their names labeled in bold letters. Will's tiny finger traced the outline of A.T. Rex, muttering facts to himself. "You like dinosaurs?" Jacob asked. Will gave him a look that clearly translated to obviously. And then, out of nowhere, the kid started talking. Not just answering with one-word responses, but actually engaging. He told Jacob about the difference between the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, about how the velociraptors in movies were way too big, and how the Spinosaurus was actually the largest land predator, not the T-Rex. For the first time, Jacob wasn't the one leading the conversation. He just listened. That night, when he went home, he ordered every book about dinosaurs he could find. By their next meeting, he had memorized ridiculous dino facts, things he never thought he'd care about. And when he casually dropped, "Did you know the Stegosaurus had a brain the size of a walnut?" Will's face lit up. That was it. That was the thing. It wasn't the expensive gifts or the elaborate outings. It was showing up, taking an interest in something that mattered to Will. And just like that, the walls started to crack. It wasn't immediate, but it was there, a shift, small but important. Will stopped treating him like a stranger and started treating him like something else. Not quite a father yet, but maybe something close. Then, just as Jacob started to feel like he was finally getting somewhere, everything fell apart. He had just wrapped up a late afternoon meeting when his phone buzzed. It was Olivia's number. He almost let it go to voicemail, thinking it was just another update about Will. But something in his gut told him to answer. When he picked up, the voice on the other end wasn't Olivia's. It was Will. And he sounded scared. "Jacob?" Jacob sat up straighter. "Yeah, buddy? What's wrong?" "It's Mom," Will said, his voice small. She fell down at work. They took her to the hospital." Jacob's stomach dropped. He was already grabbing his keys. "Where are you?" Will sniffed. "At the hospital. I don't know which one." "Put someone on the phone," Jacob ordered. A moment later, a woman's voice, probably a nurse, came through the line, giving him the hospital name. Jacob didn't waste a second. He was out the door before she even finished talking. The drive to the hospital was a blur of honking horns and red lights he barely obeyed. His mind raced through every possibility, every worst-case scenario. By the time he arrived, his pulse was hammering in his ears. He strode into the emergency room, scanning the crowded waiting area until he spotted a small, hunched figure sitting in one of the plastic chairs. Will. The kid looked up just as Jacob reached him, his eyes red-rimmed, his small hands clutching onto the sleeves of his hoodie. Jacob crouched in front of him, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey, buddy. I'm here." Will stared at him, his lip trembling. And then, without warning, he lunged forward, burying his face into Jacob's chest. Jacob froze for half a second before instinct took over. His arms wrapped around Will's small frame, holding him tight, feeling the way the kid shook against him. For the first time since this whole mess began, Jacob realized something. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about being there. Jacob had never been afraid of hospitals, but tonight, standing in the cold, sterile waiting room, he felt completely helpless. He was used to handling crises, market crashes, lawsuits, hostile takeovers, but this was different. This wasn't something he could fix with money or a well-placed call. This was Olivia, unconscious on a hospital bed. This was Will, small and terrified, clutching her hand like he was afraid to let go. Jacob had barely gotten the kid to let go of him after their moment in the waiting room, and now Will sat beside Olivia's bed, his fingers curled tightly around hers, his little chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Jacob stood behind him, one hand braced on the chair Will was sitting in, the other tightly fisted at his side. A doctor entered the room, flipping through a chart. Jacob straightened instantly, his spine snapping into perfect posture, because if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was demand answers. "What's wrong with her?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with impatience. The doctor looked up, glanced between Jacob and Will, and then sighed. "It's pneumonia. A bad case, but we caught it in time. She's dehydrated, exhausted, and severely run down. She needs rest, proper medication, and most importantly, time away from work." Jacob exhaled, a slow breath releasing some of the tension in his chest. Not life-threatening. Not fatal. But the idea of Olivia being this sick, this fragile, it didn't sit right. Olivia stirred then, eyes fluttering open, her gaze slightly unfocused before landing on Will. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, and she squeezed his little hand. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, voice hoarse. Will didn't say anything, just launched himself forward, burying his face against her arm. Olivia's free hand came up, running weakly through his hair. Jacob shouldn't have been there for this moment. It was personal, intimate, a mother and her son. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. Olivia shifted slightly, turning her gaze toward him. Her brow furrowed, like she was trying to process why he was even there. "You," she started, then let out a weak laugh. "Didn't expect you to show up." Jacob crossed his arms, ignoring the way his chest tightened at the exhaustion in her voice. "Yeah, well, apparently I'm unpredictable." Olivia smirked slightly, but the effort seemed to drain her. Jacob turned back to the doctor. "What does she need? Medicine? Specialists? Home nurses? Say the word, I'll make it happen." The doctor's lips pressed together. "What she needs is rest. She can't go back to work for at least a few weeks." Olivia groaned. "I can't afford that." "You don't have to," Jacob said immediately. Her eyes snapped to him, irritation flickering in them despite her weakness. "Jacob, you're coming with me," he said, leaving no room for argument. "I'm moving you and Will into my penthouse until you recover." Olivia let out a weak laugh, shaking her head. "Oh sure, I'll just uproot my life and move into your billionaire lair?" "Yes," Jacob said simply. "Exactly that." She scoffed. "No way. We're fine." "I'm fine." Jacob stepped closer, voice low, firm. "You passed out at work. In front of your kid. Tell me, Olivia, how fine does that sound?" She glared at him, and for a second, it felt like old times, the way they used to challenge each other, push each other's buttons. But then she sighed, turning to Will. "What do you think, bud?" she asked softly. Will, still holding on to her, looked up at Jacob. "Will there be chicken nuggets?" Jacob fought a grin. "An unlimited supply." Will nodded. "I vote yes." Olivia groaned. "Traitor." Jacob smirked. "That's a yes. Pack a bag." The next morning, Jacob realized he was in way over his head. He had expected challenges, logistics, adjustments, maybe some awkward silences, but he hadn't expected absolute chaos. By 7 a.m., Will had already taken over his kitchen. Jacob had offered to make breakfast, which in hindsight had been a terrible idea. He had barely cracked 2 eggs before Will took over, claiming he was doing it wrong. You're supposed to whisk them first, Will explained, standing on a stool, arms crossed like a tiny food critic. And that pan is too hot. You'll burn them. Jacob arched a brow. You're 8. And yet I know more about cooking than you do, Will said, unimpressed. Olivia, still weak but clearly enjoying this, snickered from the barstool where she was sipping tea. Told you, she murmured. Jacob scowled, stepping back. Fine. Go ahead, Gordon Ramsay. Let's see what you've got. Will beamed and proceeded to cook better eggs than Jacob had ever managed in his life. Breakfast was only the beginning. The school drop-off was a war zone. Jacob had insisted on driving Will to school, but nothing prepared him for the horror of the morning rush. Traffic was brutal, parents were aggressive, and Will gave him a full lecture on how carpool lines worked. You're slowing everyone down, Will pointed out as Jacob struggled to figure out where to stop. I'm following the rules. The rules don't matter. Speed is what matters, Will said wisely. Jacob nearly pulled a muscle trying not to laugh. By the time he got back to the penthouse, Olivia was waiting with an entirely too smug expression. Survived? She asked. Jacob loosened his tie, exhaling. Barely. Welcome to parenthood, she said, patting his arm. But despite all the chaos, all the unexpected adjustments, something inside him had started to settle. For the first time in his life, Jacob Lawrence wasn't just running on ambition or chasing success. He was learning how to be a father. And he liked it. Jacob had always prided himself on being adaptable, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of full-time fatherhood. Every day felt like a crash course in parenting, and he was constantly failing pop quizzes. Morning routines were chaotic. Will had an inexplicable ability to disappear the moment Jacob needed him to put on his shoes. Bedtime was a negotiation worthy of a UN summit, with Will always bargaining for 5 more minutes. And Jacob was fairly certain third-grade math had gotten harder since he was a kid because helping with homework made him question his own intelligence. But despite all of that, Jacob kept showing up. And Olivia saw it. She watched as he adjusted his entire life around Will without even realizing it. He took calls from the home office instead of the towering glass building he once lived in. His assistant, Lena, was in shock when he rescheduled an important board meeting because Will had a school event. You're canceling for a... What now? She had asked, her voice hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. A school play, Jacob repeated. Will's a tree, I think? Lena was silent for a long moment. Sir, are you okay? Do I need to call someone? Jacob sighed. Just move the meeting, Lena. When Olivia overheard the conversation, she nearly choked on her tea. You? Skipping a meeting for a tree performance? I have seen you leave a gala early to finalize a deal, Jacob. He smirked, tossing a piece of popcorn into his mouth. Yeah, well, the company will survive without me for a night. And that was the truth. For the first time, Jacob wasn't prioritizing business over everything else. He was prioritizing his family. Olivia had always been strong, but the days of resting and recovering forced her to slow down, and she hated it. She wasn't used to people taking care of her, wasn't used to leaning on anyone. But Jacob? He wouldn't let her push him away. When she tried to do too much, he gave her a pointed look. You can either rest, or I will physically force you to sit down, he warned, arms crossed. Olivia, of course, tried to defy him. But Will sided with Jacob. Mom, you're always telling me to rest when I'm sick, Will said, looking up from his dinosaur book. So now you have to listen to your own advice. Jacob grinned. Smart kid, Olivia groaned. I hate both of you. But she didn't fight it. Because she trusted him now. The teasing between them started to feel more natural, like slipping into old habits. The moments of exasperation were softened by laughter. The small touches, the lingering glances, they didn't go unnoticed. One night, after Will had gone to bed, Olivia found Jacob asleep on the couch, his laptop resting precariously on his chest, a finance report still open. She stood there for a moment, just watching him. This wasn't the same Jacob Lawrence she had left behind all those years ago. She reached down, carefully pulling the laptop away, intending to close it, but Jacob stirred, eyes blinking open groggily. "You're terrible at taking care of yourself," she murmured. His lips twitched. "I could say the same about you." They stared at each other, the air between them shifting. It wasn't just co-parenting anymore. It wasn't just history or shared responsibility. Something was happening. But before either of them could acknowledge it, Olivia got a call from her doctor. And everything changed. She had gone in for a follow-up, expecting a routine checkup to make sure she was recovering well. But when she came home that afternoon, she was quiet. Too quiet. Jacob noticed immediately. "What happened?" he asked, setting down his tablet. Olivia hesitated, as if debating how much to tell him. But then she met his gaze, and her resolve cracked. "The pneumonia. It took a bigger toll on my lungs than they thought," she admitted. "They want me to go through an extended treatment plan. It's not just rest and recovery anymore." Jacob felt the ground shift beneath him. "What are you saying?" His voice was steady, but there was something tight in his chest. Olivia took a deep breath. "I might need more time. More medical intervention." The words settled heavily between them. Jacob had never been afraid of losing before. In business, in life, he had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But this was different. Because suddenly, he was looking at Olivia and realizing he could lose her. And that was unthinkable. Will walked into the room then, completely unaware of the tension. He plopped down on the couch beside Jacob, holding up a book. "Dad, look at this new dinosaur I found." Jacob barely heard the words at first, until it hit him. Dad. Will had called him Dad. It wasn't a test. It wasn't forced. It was just natural. And Jacob knew, in that moment, that he wasn't just fighting for Olivia anymore. He was fighting for both of them. Jacob had never considered himself an emotional man. He dealt in numbers, in hard facts, in strategies that always had an exit plan. There was always a contingency, a backup option, a way to pivot if things didn't go his way. But there was no pivoting out of this. Olivia's condition wasn't something he could fix with a well-placed phone call or a signed check. He couldn't negotiate his way out of it. And that scared him more than anything ever had. For the past few weeks, he had built a rhythm with Will and Olivia, one that had started to feel like home. Dinners that ended in teasing arguments over who made the best scrambled eggs. Movie nights where we'll always pick something ridiculous and educational about dinosaurs. Even the chaos of morning school drop-offs had become something he weirdly looked forward to. But now, everything felt fragile. Temporary. And Jacob had never been more terrified of losing something he couldn't replace. He wasn't sure when Olivia noticed the change in him. Maybe it was in the way his eyes lingered on her a little longer, or how he hovered around the kitchen when she moved, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Maybe it was in the way he seemed distracted at night, staring at his phone, researching every possible treatment option as if he could outthink the problem. One evening, after Will had gone to bed, she caught him pacing the living room, fingers pressed against his temples like he was willing his brain to work harder, to find a solution that didn't exist. "Jacob." He stopped, turning to face her. She was standing by the couch, wrapped in a soft sweater, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to fix this," she said quietly. Jacob exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know how to do nothing, Olivia." She smiled, but there was something sad in it. "You being here? That's not nothing." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I should have known," he muttered. "I should have, how?" Olivia cut in, crossing her arms. "You weren't here. And that was my choice." Jacob clenched his jaw, his chest tightening. He hated that she was still carrying that. Hated that she thought she had to do this alone. "You don't have to be strong all the time, you know," he said, softer this time. Olivia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sweater. It was such a small thing, but Jacob saw it. Will, she started, her voice breaking slightly before she steadied herself. I don't want him to go through what I did. I don't want him to lose me. Jacob swallowed hard. He won't. You don't know that, she whispered. No, Jacob admitted, stepping closer. But I know he won't lose both of us. Olivia blinked, eyes searching his, as if trying to figure out whether he meant it. Jacob's voice was steady when he continued. I'm not going anywhere, Olivia. No matter what happens, you're not doing this alone. A soft sniffle from the hallway broke the silence. They both turned. Will stood there in his pajamas, his hair a messy halo of curls, his eyes wet. Jacob's stomach twisted. How much had he heard? Without a word, Will walked straight toward him. And for the first time, he hugged Jacob. Not a hesitant, uncertain touch, but a full, tight embrace, like he was afraid to let go. Jacob didn't hesitate. He knelt down, arms wrapping securely around Will's small frame, his hand resting on the back of the boy's head. Will's voice was muffled against Jacob's shirt. I don't want Mom to be sick. Jacob felt something crack inside him. I know, buddy, he whispered. I know. Will clung to him a little tighter, and Jacob didn't let go. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, quiet hope, and unspoken fears. Jacob had faced countless high-stakes situations before, but nothing had ever felt as fragile, as impossible to control, as waiting for Olivia's recovery. He was there for every appointment, every late-night moment of doubt, every exhausted sigh she tried to hide behind a brave smile. And Will was the glue that held them all together. Jacob had never expected a child to teach him what real strength looked like, but Will carried the weight of uncertainty with more grace than most adults. He was still the same stubborn, dinosaur-obsessed kid, but now, he had a habit of curling up beside Jacob when they watched movies, of reaching for his hand in waiting rooms without thinking about it. The first time Will called him Dad without hesitation, Jacob had been helping him with a school project, cutting out tiny paper planets for a solar system model. Careful, Dad, you made Jupiter too small, Will said, completely focused on the project, not even realizing what he had just said. Jacob had frozen, scissors still in hand, as his brain short-circuited. Olivia, watching from the couch, raised an eyebrow, a small smirk playing at her lips. You okay there? Jacob wasn't okay. His heart was doing something weird, his chest was too tight, and for the first time in his life, he was speechless. Will finally looked up, frowning. What? Jacob swallowed hard, shaking his head. Nothing, he said, voice softer than usual. Jupiter's definitely too small. Let's fix it. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no dramatic pause, no life-changing revelation. It just was. And maybe that was what made it real. Olivia's recovery was slow but miraculous. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and with every passing week, the color returned to her cheeks, her energy slowly creeping back. Jacob never left her side. The day she was officially declared healthy, she walked into the living room to find Jacob sitting with Will, both of them buried in a book about black holes. You two are ridiculous, she said fondly. Will grinned. Dad says he still doesn't believe time can slow down near a black hole, so I'm proving him wrong. Olivia arched an eyebrow. He's trying to argue physics with you. Good luck with that. Jacob smirked. The jury's still out on that one. Will turned to him suddenly, serious in a way that caught Jacob off guard. Mom says you used to run from things, he said. You're not gonna run anymore, right? Jacob felt the weight of that question settle into his chest. He thought about the man he had been before. The one who had let Olivia go without a fight, the one who had convinced himself he was too busy, too focused, too driven for something like love. He had spent years believing success was measured in deals closed, in numbers on a screen, in power and control. But this was real. Jacob smiled, ruffling Will's hair. No, buddy, he said. I'm not going anywhere. That night, they sat outside on the balcony, watching the stars. Will pointed out constellations, excitedly explaining them in a way only a kid who had memorized way too many science books could. Jacob and Olivia sat side by side, their shoulders brushing, comfortable in a way they hadn't been in years. For the first time, Jacob Lawrence wasn't thinking about board meetings or billion-dollar acquisitions. For the first time, he felt like he had finally won. And it had nothing to do with money. Jacob Lawrence had never doubted himself before, not in business, not in boardrooms, not in billion-dollar deals. But as he stood in his penthouse, staring down at a small velvet box in his hand, he felt something dangerously close to fear. This was supposed to be simple. He loved Olivia. He loved Will. They were already a family in every way that mattered. And yet, when it came to asking her to officially make it permanent, he found himself hesitating. Because deep down, what if she said no? Jacob had never been someone people walked away from. He was used to controlling the narrative, to setting the terms. But Olivia had left before. And if she left again, he wouldn't survive it. A small knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Will peeked in, already dressed for bed, his messy curls sticking up at odd angles. "Can I come in?" Jacob tucked the box into his pocket and cleared his throat. "Yeah, of course, buddy." Will climbed onto the leather chair across from him, swinging his legs a little. "So, when are you asking Mom to marry you?" Jacob blinked. "What?" Will tilted his head, completely unfazed. "I mean, you are, right? You guys already act like you're married. You just don't have the cake and rings yet." Jacob let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "You make it sound so easy." Will shrugged. "Well, isn't it?" Jacob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What if she says no?" Will frowned, as if the idea had never even occurred to him. "Why would she say no? She likes you. I mean, sometimes she rolls her eyes when you try to cook, but she always smiles after, so I think that means she likes you." Jacob chuckled, warmth settling in his chest. "You really think so?" Will nodded confidently. "Mom used to look sad when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She doesn't anymore. You make her happy." Jacob swallowed hard. This kid was going to undo him. Will's face turned serious. "But you have to do it right. Not in a boring way. Something special." Jacob thought about the elaborate plan he had initially designed, an extravagant weekend getaway, a dramatic dinner under the stars, maybe even a press-worthy display of romance. But sitting here, listening to Will, he knew that wasn't them. Olivia didn't want grand gestures. She wanted real. And he knew exactly where he needed to ask her. The next evening, Jacob took Olivia back to where it all began. The cafe wasn't fancy. It wasn't exclusive or high-end or filled with luxury. But it was the place where his entire world had changed. Where Will had walked up to him for the first time, stared at him like he had always known, and tilted Jacob's world on its axis. Olivia raised an eyebrow as she slid into the seat across from him. "Okay, I'll bite. Why are we here?" Jacob smirked. "You don't like it?" She glanced around at the familiar wooden tables, the warm scent of coffee in the air, and smiled. "I do. I just wasn't expecting it." Jacob took a breath. "I wasn't expecting a lot of things." Olivia's smile faded slightly, her eyes searching his. "I wasn't expecting Will to find me that day," Jacob continued. "I wasn't expecting to look into his eyes and see myself staring back. I wasn't expecting to fall in love with him before I even knew him." Olivia inhaled softly, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "And I sure as hell wasn't expecting to get a second chance with you," he admitted. "But I did. And I don't want to waste it." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the small velvet box, and placed it on the table between them. Olivia sucked in a breath. Jacob didn't get down on one knee. He didn't make a speech rehearsed for perfection. Instead, he simply opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring, a reflection of the life they had built, without excess, without pretense. "I love you," he said, his voice raw honest. "I love Will. I love the life we have, the chaos, the mornings, the movie nights, the way you tease me about my terrible cooking. And I don't want it to be temporary. I don't want to wonder if I'll wake up one day and it'll all be gone. I want this. Forever. I want to marry you, Olivia. Olivia stared at him, her eyes glistening. She didn't answer right away. And for a brief, terrifying moment, Jacob thought maybe he had gotten it wrong. Then, she let out a shaky breath and whispered, "Took you long enough." Jacob exhaled, his heart slamming against his ribs. "That's a yes?" She nodded, laughing softly as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Of course, it's a yes." He reached for her hand, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Before he could say anything else, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't like their first kiss, all those years ago, filled with youthful heat and rushed passion. It was better. It was steady. Certain. A promise. When she pulled away, she grinned. "So, does Will know you were planning this?" Jacob laughed. "Kid practically planned it for me." Olivia shook her head, a fond expression crossing her face. "Of course he did." Jacob laced his fingers through hers, feeling something settle in his chest. For years, he had been chasing the next big thing, the next deal, the next success. But here, in this quiet little cafe, with the woman he loved and the family he had built, he finally understood. This was it. His greatest achievement. His real home. The wedding wasn't extravagant, nor did it need to be. It wasn't held in a grand ballroom, or a private island resort with a VIP guest list curated for prestige. It was simple, intimate, and filled with the only thing that truly mattered, love. Jacob had let Olivia take the reins in planning, trusting her to create something meaningful, something that reflected them as they were. No expectations, no cameras, no lavish displays of wealth. Just a small garden, twinkling lights, and the people they loved. And, of course, Will. Jacob stood at the altar, dressed in a classic black suit, feeling something he hadn't in years, butterflies. Not nerves born out of fear, but anticipation. Olivia was about to become his wife, officially, permanently. He wasn't sure how he had ever lived without this feeling. Then he saw her. Olivia walked toward him, bathed in the golden glow of the sunset, her dress a simple yet stunning ivory that moved effortlessly with the breeze. Her hair was down, just how he liked it, and her eyes, those warm, knowing eyes that had seen every side of him, held only certainty. Jacob had faced thousands of people in high-stakes negotiations, but he had never been as speechless as he was in that moment. Will, standing proudly beside Jacob as his self-appointed best man, was practically bouncing on his toes. The kid had insisted on wearing a miniature version of Jacob's suit, tie and all, and Jacob had to admit, the kid pulled it off better than he did. When Olivia finally reached him, he took her hands in his, feeling the warmth of her skin. This was real. This was happening. The officiant began, but Jacob barely heard a word. His world had shrunk down to her, to the way she looked at him, to the quiet certainty settling deep in his chest. Then, it was time for their vows. Jacob hadn't written anything down. He had spent weeks trying, but nothing ever felt right. So, instead, he just spoke. "I spent so much of my life chasing things," he admitted, voice steady but filled with emotion. "I thought success meant power. That if I just built enough, worked hard enough, I would leave something behind that mattered." He exhaled, squeezing her hands. "But none of it meant anything until you and Will walked into my life." Olivia's lips trembled, her fingers tightening around his. "You taught me that love isn't about timing or convenience," he continued. "It's about choosing each other. Every day. No matter what." His voice dropped to a whisper, just for her. "And I will always choose you." There was a long, breathless silence before Will loudly sniffled from beside him. "That was a good one," the kid announced, nodding approvingly. The crowd chuckled, and Olivia laughed through her tears. "Wait till you hear hers," Jacob murmured, grinning. Olivia let out a soft, shaky breath and looked up at him with the same quiet certainty that had always drawn him in. "You're right. You did chase things," she said, her voice teasing but thick with emotion. "And I thought you'd never stop long enough to see what was right in front of you." Jacob swallowed hard. "But you did," she continued. "You came back. You fought for us. You proved me wrong, and I have never been happier to be wrong." She took a deep breath. "I love you, Jacob. And I always will." There was a long pause, then the officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me." Jacob didn't wait. He kissed her before the words were even finished. The guests cheered, but Jacob barely heard them. Olivia's hands were on his face, her lips soft and sure against his, and nothing else existed. Will, who had clearly been waiting for this part the entire time, dramatically gagged from beside them. "Oh my God!" the kid muttered. "Can we go eat cake now?" Laughter erupted through the garden, and Jacob and Olivia broke apart, both laughing. "Yes, but," Jacob said, ruffling Will's hair, "we can eat cake now." The reception was a blur of laughter, dancing, and stolen moments. At one point, Will managed to wrangle Jacob into a ridiculous dance-off, which Jacob lost spectacularly. Olivia just sat back and laughed, watching as her husband and her son became exactly what they were always meant to be, family. Later that night, after the last of the guests had left and the stars had come out, the three of them sat outside on the balcony of their home, wrapped in blankets, watching the night sky. Will lay between them, pointing up at the constellations with the same enthusiasm he had for dinosaurs. "That's Orion," he said, tracing the stars with his finger. "And that's Andromeda." Jacob, still getting used to the reality of this life, of fatherhood, of marriage, of having something so incredibly worth protecting, looked down at Will with a smirk. "I don't see a single dinosaur up there," he teased. Will sighed dramatically. "Dad, we've talked about this. Dinosaurs lived on Earth." Jacob's chest tightened at that word. "Dad." It wasn't forced. It wasn't something Will had been asked to say. It was just natural. Olivia smiled at him knowingly, resting her head against Jacob's shoulder, her fingers lacing through his. Jacob had always believed life moved in straight lines, goals, achievements, milestones, the next big thing. He had spent years chasing those lines, believing that success meant climbing higher, reaching further, proving his worth through numbers, power, and influence. But now, sitting under the stars with his son nestled between him and his wife, he realized life wasn't a straight line at all. It was a circle. It had started in a cafe, with a little boy walking up to him, tilting his head in quiet observation, and saying, "Mom said you'd pretend not to know me." And now he knew. He knew every expression Will made when he was about to ask a question that would stump Jacob for hours. He knew the exact way Olivia's eyes softened when she looked at their son, at him, like she had finally stopped waiting for him to run. He knew what real happiness felt like. Will pointed at another constellation. "That one's the Big Dipper," he said, eyes wide with wonder. Jacob smiled. "And what's the fancy science name for it again?" Will grinned, delighted that Jacob had remembered. "Ursa Major." Olivia leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder, her voice soft. "I still can't believe you actually learned all this." Jacob smirked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I had a good teacher." Will sat up suddenly, his expression thoughtful. "Hey, you know what?" Jacob and Olivia both turned to him. "What?" Jacob asked. "This is kind of like the stars," Will said, gesturing around them. "Like how everything comes back around. The Earth orbits the sun, the moon orbits us, everything keeps moving but always finds its way back." Olivia smiled. "That's poetic." Will shrugged. "It's just science." Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "You're saying we're like planets now?" "No," Will said seriously. "But think about it. If I never walked up to you in that cafe, you might have never found us." Jacob's chest tightened. The full circle moment hit him all at once. That cafe had been just another stop in his day. Just another place to check emails, review reports, exist within the bubble of his career. But Will had walked in and shattered that bubble completely. And if he hadn't? If Will hadn't found him? If he hadn't gone searching for Olivia, if he had stayed buried in his work, believing that his business was the only thing that mattered, he would have never known. Never known what it felt like to hear a little voice call him, Dad, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Never known the warmth of Olivia's laughter on a quiet evening, never known how something as simple as a bedtime story or a school drop-off could matter more than all the wealth in the world. And that thought? That thought absolutely destroyed him. Jacob reached out, pulling Will close, pressing a firm kiss to the top of his head. You're right, Jacob murmured. I would have never found my way back to you too. Will beamed. Olivia squeezed his hand. For years, Jacob had thought he was building a legacy. That his empire was the most important thing he would leave behind. But sitting here, with his family beside him, he realized his real legacy wasn't his company. It was them. Olivia tilted her head up, her voice a soft whisper against the night. So, Mr. Lawrence, do you still think money is the key to success? Jacob let out a quiet laugh. She already knew the answer. No, he said, resting his forehead against hers. Success is this. She smiled. Took you long enough to figure that out. He kissed her, slow and lingering, and felt everything fall into place. His past, his present, his future, all of it finally where it was meant to be. And this time, he wasn't running. He was home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.